We'll start in just a couple minutes. Start the music, start leading things down. Welcome to Sundays with Dracula. Welcome to my house. Enter freely and of your own will. This is chapter 4 of Sundays with Dracula. I am Edward G. Pettit of The Rosenbach in Philadelphia, which is the home of Bram Stoker's notes for Dracula. Over 100 pages of outlines, early plot ideas, and research notes compiled by the author over the 7 years he developed and wrote the book. It is an extraordinary record of the conception and development of a novel. We will see a few pages of those notes today. And joining me today, I'm very happy, I have a new co-host live from Sheffield. Are you guys in Sheffield too?
Mary is, I'm not, so I'm kind of cheating.
There you go. Well, they're from England, and Dr. Lauren Nixon is a former renegade Jane Austen scholar, now a very recent PhD at the University of Sheffield under the Center for the History of the Gothic. Her thesis that she wrote was entitled, "This Trade of Death, War and the Figure of the Soldier in Gothic Fiction 1764 to 1826. And her research interests are in the representations of masculinity, war, and national identity across the centuries. Welcome, Lauren.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
I'm so happy to have you here today. Mary Going is a PhD candidate at the University of Sheffield, exploring depictions of Jewish characters, myths, and legends in late 18th and early 19th century literature. We've been talking about some of that stuff the last couple episodes. She is also lead organizer of the Gothic Bible Project, which hosted a Buffy and the Bible conference in 2019, complete with an evening Buffy sing-along. We could do that here maybe one day too. Welcome, Mary.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Excellent. Both Lauren and Mary are co-organizers of Sheffield Gothic and the Reimagining the Gothic project, which seeks to promote accessible and diverse research in the field of Gothic studies. I want to hear a little bit more about Sheffield Gothic from the two of you and the Gothic Bible and all kinds of interesting stuff that you guys are involved in. But first, a few words about our show and the Rosenbach, our sponsor. In Sundays with Dracula, we are spending 27 weeks talking about Dracula. The novel takes place over 27 weeks from May 3rd to November 6th, and there are 27 chapters in the novel. How fortuitous. So we're talking about one chapter each week for 27 weeks. You have different, myself and then a different co-host or two, as in the case this time, every week, creating a kind of conversational annotation of the entire novel, one chapter at a time. Bram Stoker's notes for Dracula are one of the gems of the Rosenbach's collection. We also have the manuscript for Ulysses, a great Lewis Carroll collection, Irish authors, Mexican-American broadsides, Native American history and culture, Oscar Wilde, Marion Moore. We have so much great material in our collections. But while we're closed for the quarantine, you can go online and see some of our collection guides. We have gallery gateways set up so you can see some of the exhibitions that we've had recently and we have upcoming. and of course, other virtual programs and courses that I am creating this moment right now. Well, not this moment right now, because we're in the midst of one of the new programs that we've created. If you would like to make a donation to the Rosenbach so we can continue to bring shows like this and create even more programs and courses inspired by our magnificent collections, go to our website, click on the support tab. Let me show you where that is right now. And boy, I'm always slow at this. Here we go. Let me share this. This is our website. You can go over here. You can click on support. You can see all kinds of different ways to give. We also have the virtual Rosenbach now, which we just had, which just happened last week. It's normally our big fundraising dinner that we do every year. This year we were online. There's a video here you can watch with a lot of people talking. I'm on there. I do a poem. But we also have a silent auction, which is very exciting. And if you go into the auction, we even have a couple items related to Dracula. There is a Dracula happy hour at the Rosenbach, in which you and up to 10 people will come to the Rosenbach, and I will give you a personal tour of Stoker's notes, show them to you, you hold them in your hands, and then we'll go down and have a Dracula-inspired cocktail. Josh O'Neill will be joining me for that. Josh was the co-host on the first episode we did this year. He'll be returning next week. He is also the creator of the Dracula, the Evidence book project, and he will be joining me with that. There's also a little Dracula package here with a t-shirt and all sorts of fun things. So, or you could just have me come to your house and do a curated biblio cocktails, which I bring all the alcohol, I design a drink, we will talk about what literary theme you want to do. And I'm very happy to know that that's actually been very popular. We have sold 3 of them, and we have another one up for bid right now. So that is how you can help us, and I would appreciate if you did that. I also want to thank one of our audience members, Max B. Max B mailed us a check just last week with a note. I appreciate what the Rosenbach does. Really enjoy Sundays with Dracula. Hope to be with you soon. Max, thank you very much for your support, and I hope we will see you soon too. So, and I'm sure we will. A little Zoom etiquette today before we get going. There's a chat box down there. Chat amongst yourselves. There is a Q&A box. If you have a question for myself or for Lauren or Mary, put your question in the Q&A box. We'll be going, and remember that we're going through the chapter chronologically. So if you ask a question about the end of the chapter, it's going to get buried. So save your questions for when they happen in the chapter as we talk about them. And I love the chat. And remember, when you're on the chat, to click on, because the default on it is to all panelists. When you put a message, change it to all panelists and attendees, so everyone can hear what you're saying. I also read the chat after the shows, and it's so engaging and so much fun. And I actually learned from the chat too, which is really wonderful. But my favorite chat comment last week was from Janet S, and she just put in the chat, "Being Ed is exhausting, no?" And yes, it is. So I have lots to do, but I enjoy it all. So if you're going to be exhausted, it's fine as long as you're enjoying yourself, having a cocktail and smoking a pipe while you're working. How could I not? That might be exhausting, but it is certainly fun. We will have special guests on the show throughout June. I told you guys last week that Dacre Stoker was coming on June 7th, and he'll be joining us for the whole show. Leslie Klinger, author of the annotated, author of the annotated Dracula, will be joining us on June 28th at the end of next month. And now I just signed up another guest to be on the show, and that will be Grady Hendrix, who is the author of the brand new Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires. Grady is a very funny horror author. I think his books usually come out from Quirk Books. He's had several of them, including the great nonfiction Paperbacks from Hell, which is all about the whole history of 80s horror paperbacks, which I love. And Grady will be joining us, and his Southern Book Club's guide was just on the New York Times bestseller list. So that will be very nice to have Grady on the show to talk about Dracula with us. He's also doing a podcast. If you go to his website, Grady Hendrix, look him up online. He has this hilariously funny vampire podcast, and I listened to the first episode. It was all about vampire folklore, and it was really great. So I'm really looking forward to having him on the show. But today on the show, I have Mary and Lauren. Tell me a bit about Sheffield Gothic, and well, tell everyone a bit about Sheffield Gothic and the Reimagining the Gothic project.
Okay, well, it is a group of postgraduate students. So in the UK, we call master's students and PhD students postgraduate students, which gets really confusing when you're on international conferences, because in the US it's graduate students, but postgraduate students and early career researchers, headed by, so the Centre for the History of the Gothic is the research centre, and then Sheffield Gothic is our little group within it. It started out as a reading group that would meet once a month to discuss different texts. It's kind of lonely sometimes being a PhD student. You're quite cut off. There's a lot of competition. It can feel really alienating. And that's not really what the Gothic is about. So we decided to band together, and we started our own project and our own group, and that grew into Wikipedia editing events, networking days, training days, talks and lectures. Then we started doing symposiums, which turned into conferences. We do all sorts of stuff now. We have a blog, we have a Twitter, we just launched a YouTube channel.
Yes, your new show.
Yeah,
so
yes, so it's working. So yeah, it's kind of half a research project and half a way to bring people together from all sorts of different backgrounds, all sorts of different levels of study, or whether they're in or out of academia, to talk about the Gothic and to try and keep it not alive necessarily, but keep it from, becoming something on the dusty shelves of the institution.
True, because I find there's often so many authors that you wind up, you do in grad school, and you know that only graduate students are reading these, and you want other people to do it too.
Yeah.
Mary,
I'll let you talk about the projects because you're the mastermind.
I was just going to say we want it to be fun and accessible and welcoming to everyone. So often at our events, the food will just be like a kind of children's party with like children's food and sweets and stuff like that.
Finger sandwiches.
We'll have games. We'll get people to do interactive talks. We've had people do like playthroughs of games before. We'll often do like games night. So any kind of way to get people involved in a fun way, and like you say, breaking out of academia and making it accessible to people beyond academia, but also making it fun for people in academia as well. So we have Reimagining the Gothic is our kind of main kind of flagship project, I guess. This year would have been our sixth annual conference and creative showcase. Obviously the plague happened, so we haven't been able to do that. But we're trying to do a lot of online stuff instead. We've had the blog for a while, so we have a few series on there. So I've got my kind of Gothic Bible blog series, and then I also have a Buffy blog series as well. So that's an obsession of mine.
Good. My 15-year-old daughter just started watching Buffy, and she's she's into the second season. I can't remember how far she got. She might even be further than that because she'll binge watch. And so she is discovering, and it's great. She's really been the only I have 5 daughters, and she is the youngest, and none of them are interested in anything monster related ever. And it's like most of my life is, and I do all this stuff. And that's okay. We have lots of Austen and Shakespeare and all kinds of other things we do together. But she's starting to, as long as because Buffy's perfect because there's a lot of what she calls tea in it. There's a lot of tea in it. there's a lot of, you know, gossip, relationship back and forth, and so
it's a teen drama.
Yeah.
It's a teen drama with vampires.
So Buffy missed me when it first aired because it was in the 90s, and I was just into my 20s, and I'd kind of out of college, and kind of it hit. I think it was on exactly when I stopped watching TV for about, like, I don't know, 5 to 10 years. Like, it just, I didn't go home and watch TV at night. I was just constantly going out or doing whatever, socializing, and so I missed Buffy, the whole Buffy run when it first was on, and I was only able to go to it afterwards, and it ain't aimed for, you know, 52-year-old, you know, men anyway. So, you know, but, you know, it's still enjoyable. But you mentioned the Gothic Bible. Tell people what that is.
Okay, so yeah, that's a project that I work with a few people at the University of Sheffield from the English department, but also the biblical department. And my research is very much focused on the intersection of religion and literature and the Gothic. So it's just a way, an output from my research, I guess, but also other people who are interested in those kinds of themes. And yeah, like you say, one of the things that we got to do was a Buffy conference, which was great. We had 2 days of papers, people coming all around the world to talk about Buffy and religion, which was great for me. It was all of my favorite things. And we had an artist who did, she created a kind of grimoire of everyone's talks. So all the pages were everyone's talks, which was a really great kind of way to memorialize that conference. And and then yeah, we also had a sing along in a deconsecrated church, which I would recommend.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I like that. Good. Someone has asked me already, obviously, Ed, what are you drinking? But first, what are you guys drinking?
I have, it's hot, it's humid here at the moment, so I have peach, elderflower, and orange green tea iced tea.
Ooh, nice.
It's really, really refreshing. I'll probably end up drinking the whole thing in about 5 minutes.
Okay. All right. If you have anything next to you, like you have I have a refill ready to go. So.
See, I should have done that. I've left the jug in the fridge, and I should have brought it up with me.
At some point, maybe it'll be like you'll dash off and get it while we're talking. So.
I'll text the partner downstairs and say bring me iced tea.
Mary, do you have a tea as well?
I am a stereotypical Brit. I have hot tea in a spooky bat mug.
There you go.
Earl Grey, because that's basically all I drink.
Well, okay. Well, to honor you guys today, and I knew you would be drinking tea, and so my cocktail is actually tea-based. It is a mint tea and bourbon. The bourbon is actually called Bloody Butcher Bourbon. It is from New Liberty, which is a local distillery around here, and of the great label on it too. But it's mint tea and bourbon and a little sugar syrup, a little Demerara syrup in it, and there's a little, you know, mint sprig on top and maraschino cherries, because I could just eat those out of the jar anyway. But I'm calling it the Bloody Good Tea. So there you go. So have to honor people who may be cursing in Britain, and have to honor the bourbon that is in it. So that is my Bloody Good Tea. That is the cocktail for today that I would highly recommend. Adam P has asked us a question off the bat, and I think this is and this is something maybe we can maybe we'll hit today. We'll wind up talking about it, but I find this very interesting because, as you know, when I set this show up, I knew some people who were very interested in Dracula and had always been and done work with it, so I immediately invited them to co-host with me. But then when I put it together, I thought, man, are people going to think this is old guys talking about Dracula? And because I really wanted, you know, I want as much, you know, perspective on this novel as we can put on it. And so I found you guys, and I think, well, there clearly it'll be different perspective than from what I've done with the text, from what the other creators and collectors and fans that I have on the show have done with it. But he says, Adam asks that since we have the first female panelist, do you think there is a difference in how men and women see the novel, either historically and now? Do you?
Yes, is the short answer. I am quite resistant to the female and male Gothic idea. I think it's quite redundant, and I think it's something that we need to move past, because we shouldn't be binarizing gender anymore.
Yes.
One thing.
Absolutely.
But also I think from reading Dracula as a teenager, from seeing Dracula on, so often it's included on A-level courses, so they'll be about 17, 18 when they're reading it, and I think definitely seeing it on stage and adapted. I think reading it as a reader who identifies as a female, I think I do find things in it, or found things in it, particularly the first time I read it, that perhaps my male friends and male students maybe didn't see. I love Lucy. She's one of my favorite characters, and I think I remember being so enraged the first time I read it, putting it down and walking away because I couldn't believe what happened to Lucy.
Yeah.
Spoiler. And I do think there is a difference, and I think it would be interesting to think about why that is. I'm always cautious of having those discussions of, sometimes they can be a little bit too oversimplified. Girls like these things, boys like these things.
Yeah.
But I think, considering that this novel comes out around the same time as discussions of things like The New Woman, that you have that kind of stuff coded into it. We know that Stoker himself as a writer had certain anxieties and concerns about gender and gender roles. I think it's really interesting to see how it's aged. And I know I said this to you when we first spoke, and I love Dracula's afterlife. I love to see how we've interpreted Dracula and where it goes. And I do think it's really interesting the things that we adapt from Dracula and the elements of it that we pick up on. And I think it's telling how its audience has shifted, particularly for more modern readers. So yeah, I do think there is a difference, and this goes for everything. There's always perspectives. I'm always really keen to ask my students what their perspective on a text is, because they're 18 and they're 13 years younger than me, and they're going to have a completely different stance on Alexander Pope than I did when I was 18. And they tell me stuff and I'm like, oh wow, I've never thought about that.
And age is really a signifier. I mean, age really changes how you perceive things, and you just know that as you read over the ages too. When you read stuff when you're really young, you go back to it. It's like everything seems different. So obviously, your perspective has changed, and what you will offer will be different. But I agree with you too. But I'm always I am afraid of, just as we have learned that gender isn't really a binary thing, that we shouldn't also translate that into binary, ways of looking at text or art or anything in general, or talking about any ideas in general. But especially the newer women scholars who were coming out in, say, the 60s and the 70s, who were showing us all of these ways that far too much of literary criticism was just bordering on mansplaining, especially when they were dealing with texts written by women. That I didn't need it. I don't need any more proof. I mean, the Mad Woman in the Attic and everything that comes after that really demonstrates that we do need multiple perspectives.
Yeah.
And so hopefully you guys will be giving me some new perspective. And we've talked very little bit about Dracula, the three of us. So I'm really, I had a very good idea of, I had conversations about Dracula with the other co-hosts, but I have not really had them so much with you. So I'm really interested in what you bring to this, and hope you'll come back. Mary, did you have anything to add to that?
I guess the one thing that I would add is, I think last week when you were talking about the scene with the three weird sisters, and I think most of your conversation focused on the kind of the heterosexual sexual fantasies. And
I caught myself doing that and tried to stop, but then I was so wrapped up in it.
And I think I said this to Lauren. For me, that's always been, you know, the queer scene. And I think just as much as we need to acknowledge, you know, different ways of reading it through gender lenses, I think we can also queer it as well. And vampires are so great because they're not tied to any one thing, and they're also not tied to any kind of binary. Their existence is almost like multiple. They can be anything, you know, pansexual, bisexual. So yeah.
I was glad I had Josh on with me last week to rein in that part of me, which he did, quite well. So because that's how he approaches the text too, and then how he really wanted to add that element from the notes. You know, I want him from the
I'm
notes.
glad that you did talk about that, because that's really interesting, and I think for me that's always been the thing that I remember about Dracula is his desire and his want to possess Jonathan, more than you know, any other kind of sexual desire in the text.
Let's stay on that a little bit, just so I mentioned this to wrap up from last week. There was a little, we talked a little bit about Bram Stoker's adoration of Walt Whitman. And I started talking about the letter that he wrote to the poet but didn't send. And somebody quickly corrected me, but I didn't learn until afterwards. But I had misremembered a lot of this story. And I went back to David Scull, was reading his bio on it. And then I also actually recently picked up the Dublin Years, the Lost Journal of Bram Stoker from Dacre and Elizabeth Miller. Which is actually, and covers the period when it's parts of Bram's journal when he was growing, and it includes him writing about Walt Whitman and pieces of that Walt Whitman letter that he had written and didn't send, but only just held on to it. What he did for about 4 years, he held on to it. And somebody posted, Holly posted a nice a link to an article on our Facebook group, Sundays with Dracula. About from, I think it was from the National Endowment of the Humanities in America, about Bram and Walt's relationship and how they wrote to each other and met each other 3 times. So thank you, Holly, for that. But Bram did write an adoring letter to Walt Whitman. And he didn't send it. And he waited about 4 years. And then he had gotten involved and he gave a little talk kind of defending Whitman's poetry, I think at Trinity. And then sent it, and then wrote a new letter and said, here's a letter that I wrote when I was young too that I haven't sent yet, and sent them both. And Bram got to meet Walt Whitman 3 times, all in tours with Henry Irving. And it's funny, the first time they come over on tour, Bram is going to meet Walt Whitman, and Henry Irving here is just like, what? Oh, I'm going to that. And Irving kind of, you know, butts himself in, and he's the one that gets to talk with Walt first, and then Bram does, and really feels this great connection. And then 2 other tours when they were over in America, he got to come down and meet, because they hit Philadelphia a couple times. And Walt Whitman was living in Camden, which is just over the bridge from Philadelphia. It's just across the Delaware River, for the people who don't know. And the whole time, that whole end of Whitman's life, I don't know how many years it was, when he was living in his Camden house. He was in Philadelphia, you know, frequently. He would just come over the bridge and come across on a ferry. And as he come across the bridge, it was coming across on the ferry then. And now there is a Walt Whitman bridge actually that goes, you know, over to Jersey. So when they would come here to the East Coast, and especially Philadelphia, Bram could easily set up a time to meet with Whitman. And whether or not you can go as far as I think I do, but it's I understand people who might not think that it's necessarily this kind of homoerotic letter the way he's writing it, and Bram's kind of Bram's idea that he loves the male form, but it's certainly adoration. And Bram has this, you know, not just with Whitman but also with Henry Irving, and there were men that Bram Stoker who completely adored and was devoted to.
Yeah, don't forget Oscar Wilde.
And
Stoker and Wilde's relationship is, I think it was Talia Schaffer wrote a really great article about this in the 90s. And I think Heath Sedgwick talks about it a little bit. But they had that kind of, not only literary love triangle going on, but their friendship, from what we understand, from what biographical evidence there is, seems to have been quite kind of love-hate. You've got that kind of rivalry, but also admiration. And I think when you look at a lot of Stoker's relationships with other, particularly male writers, you seem to get quite a lot of that sort of borderline between multiple passions and multiple emotions. And I think you can read a lot into what happens in that space in between those multiple passions. I've always found that really interesting about Stoker, particularly the relationship with Wilde. I think Dracula comes out around the same time as Wilde's trial. I'd have to double check that. I wouldn't want to say it for certain.
I remember if the trial's 96 or 97. It's pretty, they're and clearly as he's working on the novel, Anastasia just put in the chat, Wilde's trial was 95.
1895.
Yeah, which is when, Importance of Being Earnest had just gone on the stage,
yes.
And on Valentine's Day it opens. And then it was shortly after that the Wilde's, I don't know if he's arrested, but it's because it's, he's bringing the case to trial, which was crazy.
Yeah.
Oscar, why did you counter sue or whatever you did? So, but yeah, it's all, and Stoker's obviously aware of it. It's very much a part of his life, especially as he's working in the arts of the theater. But not to mention, to know Oscar as well as he did, they both come from Dublin, and also Stoker knew Wilde's parents well, and Florence, Stoker's wife, was also, maybe Oscar wanted to marry her. I just see that so much that I wonder, is there real evidence, do we know that?
I believe so. I'm trying to remember. So I for a while worked in a museum, and we had a special exhibition. It was a prison museum, and we had Oscar Wilde's cell door. And we did a whole special exhibition, and I did research at the time, and I'm now trying to remember what I did and didn't read. Correct, I'm potentially wrong about this, but I think there was a sort of suggestion of a promise of an engagement. I don't think it was necessarily formalized, but I think there was a sort of a potential.
Oscar did want to marry Florence.
Yes, yeah. And I think perhaps there was kind of some whisperings that they were going to get engaged. And then obviously that did not happen.
Grant stepped in.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right.
All right. We had another, we had what I think is then the final word on the whole aquiline nose issue. And Adam P., who has been all over this and talking about it, I think he has cracked the case of the aquiline nose. Adam went to Stoker's biography of Irving, and in that, Stoker describes Irving's nose as being of the Jewish aquiline. So at least by then, when he's writing that in the early 20th century, and I think you can expand that to his adult life, Stoker did associate aquiline as a kind of signifier of Jewishness in someone's nose. Mary, do you have anything on that? Because I know that you look at these kinds of things and just in general about Stoker being anti-Semitic in his descriptions in Dracula.
Yeah, well, on the aquiline nose kind of specific point, I would just say that in terms of racism and anti-Semitism, there doesn't have to be any logic to the kind of things that people use against other people. So just because one word used to mean Roman in another context, that's fine. An anti-Semitic or a racist person is just going to take that and use it, and it doesn't, they don't have to defend what they're doing, because that's not the point. That's not the point of anti-Semitism or racism. It's to discriminate. So there doesn't necessarily have to be any logic. necessarily, and I think that's why there's a bit of confusion with that, and with a lot of terms, especially when you look at the constructions of Jewishness. Some of the kind of stereotypes are really contradictory. You have the kind of the poor Jewish person, and then they're obviously also always rich. They don't have any power, but they also always control governments and things like that. So there's these stereotypes aren't necessarily rooted in fact, or what's real, because that's not the point of them. But yeah, in terms of Irving, I think that Irving, and especially Irving's portrayal of Shylock, I think definitely influenced Stoker's construction of Dracula. So in my chapter on Jewish vampires, I kind of talk about Shylock a lot, and I think he is really important, and that relationship between blood and flesh and money, and the bond of flesh that's in the Merchant of Venice, and Shylock, is really important. I think there's also a link there with wolves. There's a really famous line that Shylock says, "If you call me dog, beware my fangs," which I think is just I think it's really interesting to note that you have this whole link of wolves and that kind of vampiric appetite. And obviously Irving's portrayal of Shylock was, acclaimed at the time, but specifically for a kind of sympathetic portrayal. So Shylock is vengeful, but he's also, you can understand his motives. So it's a tradition that starts earlier in the century with Edmund Kean, who takes Shylock and kind of portrays him in this sympathetic mold. Yeah. But Irving really kind of pushes that to the fore, and he toured America with that production, and I think those kinds of themes is kind of, this person is a monster, but maybe there's something else there. Maybe we can understand the motives. I think that there's a little bit of that in Stoker's Dracula.
Is there a way that people can read your chapter on Jewish vampires?
Yes. So it's in a book called Horror and Religion. It's published by the University of Wales Press. But I know academic books can be expensive.
Is it academically priced? Is it an institutional price, or do you know if it's?
I think it's fairly reasonable. It's paperback.
He tries to keep prices more reasonable.
You send me a link to that. I'll put the link on the Sundays with Dracula Facebook page.
If anyone has any issues getting a hold of it, then I would be happy to email it as well. If people
maybe just share the chapter on Jewish vampires, that we could share with people in some way.
Yeah, if people do want to read that, I can send it to you. I don't know how we.
All right, that is your project. You are bringing what is normally dense academic talk within the ivory tower out to everyone to enjoy it. So
I would want people to read it.
Yeah, we will facilitate. I'm interested in that, absolutely. Last week I talked at the end of the show. There's no agreed upon name for devotees of Dracula. So I started asking people for suggestions as to what we could call ourselves. Somebody mentioned that maybe it's our cult name. Yes, it will be our cult name, our Dracula cult name. And we came up with some choices, and I put them on a poll. And today we're going to vote on it. Here's the poll. I'm launching the poll now. I'm even allowing panelists to vote. The poll has just been begun. The choices on it are Dracularians, Draculians, Draculaniacs, Dracaholics. I'm going to vote for that. Dracuphiles, Dracunauts, like an astronaut, Dracunaut, and Draculons, so Lons. So there are the choices. The end of today, just vote on that all day. Oh boy, they're like, the numbers are jumping right. Are you guys seeing the numbers jump right now? Dracularians is in the lead. Dracuholics, maybe because I pushed it, is up there. So is Dracuphiles. There were some funny ones too that I didn't add, like Fangnatics. I thought that was very good. Dracloons. This one I really love. Dothraki. That's a good one. That's clever. I like that. Homo sapiens, I thought was good. And then there was a couple Stoker was Stokers, the Stoked, and the Counted. Ooh, that's clever, I thought, but I didn't go with it for the poll. So anyway, that poll is happening right now. In the lead is Dracuphiles, followed by Dracularians and Dracuholics. Draculons and Dracunauts has not gotten any votes yet. So not that I'm plugging them, but there you go. We'll hit that later today and come up with a name that I will then use on emails that I send to the group. So I should have asked you guys for some contributions too. And I did. Do you have any? Well, it's too late to add them to the poll now, but.
I quite like Dracuphiles.
Do you like Dracuphiles?
Yeah, that's good.
I like Draculaniacs.
Yeah. Draculaniacs was the one I had originally really liked, and I found 0 Draculaniacs online. So I thought, like the term doesn't even come up in a Google search. So I thought it would have been good. So we'll find out. I'll reveal the winner later in the show. I'll also put it on our Facebook page, and then we'll have a name to call ourselves. So it's good to name, come up with your name for your own group, rather than have someone else come up with it. So, which is generally the history of humans. Let's start talking about the chapter. Are we ready for that?
Yeah.
Good. We're in chapter 4. At the end of chapter 3, the vampire women, brides, children, sisters of Dracula have just been satisfied with their bag of baby instead of feeding on Dracula, or instead of feeding on Jonathan. Dracula's giving them the baby in the bag, and Jonathan fainted at the end of the last chapter. Go Jonathan. And chapter 4 is still, and it's still, we're still there in the castle. It is Jonathan's journal continued. So it's now, but now it's the morning of May 16th. And he is, I awoke in my own bed. If it be that I had not dreamt, the Count must have carried me here. And then a little bit after that, well, he talks about my watch was still unwound, and I am rigorously accustomed to wind it the last thing before going to bed. So he's recognizing that there's been a, that he has been out of it for a time. But then he says that of one thing I am glad, if it was that the Count carried me here and undressed me, he must have hurried in the task, for my pockets are intact, and he didn't find his diary. He didn't find this journal. But as Josh mentioned last week, the fact that the Count carried me here and undressed me after, he has, had this experience with, the other vampires, and also he's told the other vampires, this man belongs to me. Why does he even need to undress Jonathan? Like, why can't he just put him in the bed? There's clearly no reason that he has to be in his pajamas or anything. He could just put him in the bed, but he undressed him. He didn't just drop him in the bed with his clothes. Is this too easy to read into?
No, I don't think so. I think on the one hand, it's incredibly queer. And when I say queer, I mean in the kind of academic sense of the term. So we use queer as a sort of, to queer something is to make it other. So, we do use it when we're talking about homosexual or sapphic representations in texts, but also just if we're talking about like subversion and things like that. But I just have to kind of clarify that we use it as a positive term. I know it has a little bit of a fraught history, but we use it as an overwhelming.
Some people do get still upset over the term.
And I guess it's just something to kind of to just clarify, is that when I say we can read this as queer, I mean that in a positive sense. But also I think there's like a care here. And I think this is the thing that always complicates Dracula as monster throughout the text, is that he still has an element of decorum. He's still gentlemanly. I look a lot at, chivalry and what makes a gentleman, and representations of masculinity. And I always think this, that he's like carefully folded and laid out Jonathan's clothes, that he's not like rifled through his pockets. Jonathan says, he must have been hurried in his task, but I've always read it as actually he's just made this declaration of possession. But we could also read it as, this is if Dracula sees Jonathan as his possession or property, there is this kind of care to it. He carries him back to his room, he carefully undresses him, he doesn't violate his privacy, he places him in bed so that he'll be comfortable, and he wakes the next morning. And I think that really adds, and Jonathan doesn't necessarily see it, but I think for the reader it gives another element to Dracula, that we're seeing him through Jonathan's eyes, but that doesn't mean we have to see him the way that Jonathan describes him.
Yeah.
So I really like this bit.
He also makes his bed. He also cooks food. I mean, he is, but is there, in all of that, and even in the undressing, is there an element of the kind of subterfuge of Dracula, that he's just trying to make him seem like everything's normal? That if Jonathan wakes up and he's undressed, then and perhaps this is his detail with the watch too, that if he's dressed for bed, I must have just forgotten, and maybe what I experienced didn't happen, because obviously I didn't wind my watch, so I would have wound my watch though. So that's Jonathan's clue that Dracula's subterfuge didn't work. Mary, you have something? You're even opening a book.
Yeah, I mean, this just always reminds me of Jonathan as a Gothic heroine, and I think this bit as well, him, looking for the clues. My watch wasn't wound, still got my diary, I guess it wasn't a dream, I'm gonna have to, I must watch for proof. It's very Emily St. Aubert from Anne Radcliffe's The Mysteries of Udolpho. And it's, I mean, I think that's why it's reminding me of that, because there's that scene where there's a scene in Udolpho where Emily finds all of these the bloodstains on the walls of the castle, and she still continues to investigate, and she's trapped in this castle by Montoni. And I think that's what's happening here, is that Jonathan is realizing that he is, at the mercy of this thing, this person, who knows, like you say, he's just handed over a bag of baby, and
go baby.
He's fainted, and again, that's very Emily, in kind of, the Gothic heroine faints to protect herself, and that's exactly what Jonathan's done, but he's still not deterred. So
that's interesting. You just did something with perspective. I'm sorry, you did something with perspective there, which I find fascinating, because last week when I was talking about Jonathan identifying himself with the Gothic heroine, it was in this kind of, that I am the passive victim. And you just turned that around and said, no. Fainting is a self-defense mechanism. Safety, that is something that keeps you safe. And there's a great example of a difference in perspective in what's happening. Thank you.
And the Gothic heroine is an incredibly powerful figure that we tend to not see as modern readers, because we read the Gothic heroine as passive, because we read it with modern sensibilities. When you compare the Gothic heroine to the sentimental heroine who came 40, 50 years before, so if you compare any Radcliffe heroine to Richardson's Pamela or Clarissa, the famous heroines of sensibility, they are very passive. They don't move, they don't, they try to escape and they try to do things, but, Pamela attempts to escape, sees a cow that she thinks is a bull that she thinks is the devil, and chooses not to. Like Emily and Adeline and Elena are kind of, they move as much as they are able to move. And the only thing that stops Emily St. Aubert and Udolpho from moving is that she knows that if she's to go out into the world, she'll be ruined. because Montoni is her legal guardian. But she's very active. She, you know, she searches, she questions, she challenges. She has to become very powerful and very stoic to be able to survive the mental trauma of the castle. And she's always investigating, but she does faint, because fainting is what protects, you know, it's what protects her femininity, because even the most horrific of Gothic villains is unlikely to completely, you know, pass that final boundary, but also because it's like a sort of trauma response, you know, she goes as far as she's able to go. And Jonathan inhabits that same model. Whether it's as powerful when Jonathan's doing it as it is when the Gothic heroine is doing it is maybe more up for debate. But I think maybe that's one thing that sometimes people's criticism of Jonathan is that when we think back to the Gothic heroine, when we think of this kind of fainting, swooning, oh, how terrible, I couldn't possibly. But the Gothic heroine's not superstitious. She refuses to believe in ghosts or demons. She's very rational, you know, she's very kind, she's very strong. But when we read her in the 21st century, we're like, oh, come on, like, climb out the window, run away, tell somebody. But actually, in terms of, you know, 1790, she's a badass. It was intended to be a heroine that was a lot more empowering than what had come before. And then 100 years later, we have a male Gothic heroine in the same situation. Do
male authors write Gothic heroines late like that? I'm thinking Wilkie Collins, and I'm thinking, the Laura Fairley in The Woman in White is very, kind of weak and passive, but Marion is super strong. But then, of course, Marion can't quite exist as a woman for men.
Yeah, Collins is slightly more problematic because he splits them in two. So you have the smart, powerful heroine who is also in terms of the narration hideous, and there's that weird scene at the beginning where he's describing the form of Marion, unrestrained by stays, and then she turns around and he's like, oh my god.
Yeah.
And then he ends up living in this weird.
He even says and she was ugly, and it's like an point. Like,
and then he ends up living in this weird threesome with them, where he gets to have the best of both worlds. But are
you talking about Wilkie Collins, the author? Because he was.
Well, that also.
His literal life, he has. Two different women.
It's a bit different. Yeah, the late 18th century heroine is a bit different. You do get male writers who, and this is why the whole male-female Gothic thing is problematic, because you have male writers writing female Gothic, and you have female writers writing male Gothic. So you have people like Charlotte Dacre writing stuff like Zafloya, and you have people like Frances Latham writing stuff like The Midnight Bell, which is one of Austen's horrible novels. It's not as common. Is it more common in the 19th century, Mary, would you say, or do you think it kind of dies out?
Possibly. I don't know.
It's kind of like it's kind of an early Gothic tradition. I think because it's directly responding to the sentimental heroine and kind of pushing back against that very restrictive, passive. You've got all these women sitting at home while there's a war raging in Europe, being told not to worry about it. And I think Gothic fiction is the way that they go, well, I do have worries, and I'm going to express the worries in this page. But it does, I think that the classic Gothic heroine is more of a female, or not necessarily, I think you see it resurging in the 21st century. I think it's more of a non-masculine trope, is what the best way that I could think of to say it.
And talk about being problematic too, especially with this novel too, because if part of it is Dracula kind of playing with Jonathan, trying to convince him of things, it's interesting because he's gaslighting Jonathan. Which is something that happens to the women. I mean, it's all women in white. It's purely gaslighting, and Jonathan is put in that position now that Stoker's kind of turning this on its head with his male character. Shortly after that, at the end of that paragraph, Jonathan is concerned because he's full of fear. Nothing can be more dreadful than those awful women who are, in italics, waiting to suck my blood. First, that's, well, that's kind of a jump for Jonathan. Is that a mistake on Stoker's part? Because Jonathan probably shouldn't know that yet. How does he even know that they're vampires? Because he's shown zero knowledge for what vampires are up till now. And also, is that really what they were trying to do? Yeah. What do you guys, how do you take with that? Was Stoker nodding? Was it a nod?
Well, I guess you have to take everything that Jonathan says with a pinch of salt, because he's writing his journal and we just have to believe him. So who knows what else he's seen or what he hasn't seen. And I think that, there's the stuff that you said in the chapter before about where he kept qualifying all the discussion about the women with, if Mina sees this, don't worry, I was under their spell because of so maybe he has seen more than he's let on, maybe he hasn't, or maybe it's just a kind of a mistake that Stoker did, in which case I guess a wizard did it.
I wonder if it's even also related to, and there's another moment, this happens later, that because of things that we know he was working on, but we don't have, a complete manuscript for the scenes that he may have written earlier, that Jonathan may have been included into something, especially in the whole, trip to Styria, Germany, the Munich Dead House. And Jonathan may have had the opportunity to put this information together earlier, and this is one of those kind of textual vestiges of something that Jonathan should know, but
Yeah, and I mean he's gathering evidence in this scene, and then he's saying that he's going to go and find more, and he's making a record of what he's seen. It's only later, when everyone else comes in, that he becomes a bit terrible and not very good at picking up clues and stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I guess that would make sense if in an earlier edition or an earlier version that he would have had a more kind of solo role in that kind of investigating.
And I suppose, this is diary format, so if we consider the text as written to be the material text, so what we are reading is, the diary that Jonathan writes that day. We've all had situations where we write something down and then 3 days later you look at it and you're like, did I write that? Did I think that? So I guess there's an argument that if we read it as a material text, that what we could read into it is that confusion in Jonathan. And I guess a sort of retrospective postmodern reading would be that this fractured knowledge signals something.
Yeah. We're missing days in the journal too.
Yeah, I do wonder if it's an editorial mistake that
it winds up being the effect of what does happen is that that it is fractured. And we are missing information because we're missing days. We must be missing information. I mean, and then it continues.
I like that. I suspect it's probably a mistake, but I prefer to see it as, part of this fractured Gothic narrative. I'm trying to remember the quote. I think it's from James Joyce too, like the author's mistakes are works of genius or something like that. I can't remember what it was, but when you make a mistake, it's but and honestly too, but you also write from your unconscious, so it's hard to hard to really know what is a mistake anymore once you've put it out there. But there's another jump. Then we get a jump. All that's like super significant, and then it's May, and then it's 19th, May 19th. 9 days go by. What the hell's happening in those 9 days, Jonathan? He recounts how he tried to revisit the room of the vampire women. The door was forcibly closed. This is what actually on May 18th, and the door was forcibly closed, so he couldn't go in there. And in the evening, that's when the Count tells Jonathan to write 3 letters and date them, so he knows how long he has to live. But that jump ahead of 9 days, we're obviously not getting everything from his journal.
it's also a reminder of the opening epigraph of the novel that, you know, these things were put together by some unknown editor, whether that's Stoker or not. So whoever has put this together may have decided these are the only journal entries that matter. But Anastasia K, I sent this to you guys too. Anastasia K had a really interesting question, and I thought maybe that this would be a good time to answer it. Anastasia wrote that, in brief, I am interested in time in the first few chapters that we've read, both in experiencing it and measuring it. We've read, for example, that Jonathan travels further east from industrializing of the Transylvania, and then you get the accuracy of timekeeping and the adherence to regular standardized time breaks down, trains are late, the carriage ride isn't really on schedule. And then in Dracula's castle, Jonathan's constantly losing time, falling asleep, he's fainting, he's unsure how much time has passed. The longer he stays at the castle, Anastasia writes, the more sporadic his diary entries become. And she's wondering if there are other interpretations beyond, you know, just the kind of superficial, you know, that it's the difference between Jonathan being in the civilized world and, you know, this world where they don't really keep time so well. Did you guys have anything? Did you think about that one, or did you have time?
Yeah, a little bit. Do you want to go first, Mary, or should I jump in?
You can go.
So one thing that it made me think of is the Gothic's really interested, particularly earlier on, with the idea of feudalism. And so in 1762, Richard Hurd writes this treatise on Gothic romances with a small r. And he talks about how, you know, chivalry was the refining force of feudalism, as if feudalism was like this one identifiable thing. But he talks a lot about, you know, feudalism, and feudalism being this kind of unrestrained, unbound, uncivilized, Gothic, as in barbaric thing. And the thing that always strikes me about Jonathan's journey towards Castle Dracula is that the further he gets, the further out of civilization he moves, and the closer to the castle he becomes. The castle itself is symbolic of feudalism. It's a remnant and a relic of the feudal age. It's a relic of the feudal system. You know, there's the way for the entry on the 28th of May, when Jonathan's talking about the Roma that are coming by, that, you know, they're outside of the law, they take the name of one of the nobles. That's a very feudal concept. And I kind of wonder if that loss of time and that loss of structure is playing on the Gothicness of feudalism, and that anxiety that, particularly in the kind of mid to late 19th century, about regression and transgression and losing that if you lost your civilization, you might lose your humanity and you might become bestial or monstrous, or you'd lose that kind of spark of civilization. And I always kind of read Jonathan's increasingly sporadic entries and increasingly fractured narrative, and his voice as well, as being that sort of descent into feudalism. Because in the feudal system, someone like Dracula is permitted to exist and to be unchallenged and to have power. And I think later on, when you get Dracula's arrival in England, that's what that to me is always kind of speaking to. So I think for me, this time and this slowing down of time and this loss of time and loss of structure, because in a feudal system, how important is it if it's the 17th or the 18th of May? You know, who makes the time? Who is time? You know, Dracula is the person that makes the time because he's the Lord. He decides the calendar. So that's kind of my interpretation of it. That it's this kind of like the terrifying, oh God, we're going backwards. Yeah. You know, we're death marching towards this Gothic time that the rest of Europe has abandoned.
As I think it's the part of that bigger, you know, it's not just the regulation time, it is that bigger picture of kind of past and present. Old primitive world moving into the present. but also I think day and night too, which is really interesting here, because Jonathan seems to lose track of, he even says at one point, I haven't seen him in the day. Well, you were shaving that day, remember? And you saw him. So, and the fact that day versus night thing, that he feels safe in the day, we'll come up to that soon, that becomes a kind of defining concept of vampire narratives as well, that, day and they can't be, and night they're all powerful. So, Mary, did you have something to add to this?
I mean, I agree with everything that Lauren said. I've always thought that, especially the trains are such an important signifier of kind of modernity and the now. And I think, Dracula's always been a really important Gothic text, because so many Gothic texts are set in the past, and Dracula is specifically set in the now, for the 19th century. As Jonathan travels to Transylvania, the trains, get slower, they get less reliable, and now he's losing track of time. So I've always seen it as that kind of, this is going backwards in time. But I think just, I think it also speaks to maybe quarantine time that we're all experiencing now. So we're in week 8, week 9 of quarantine here in the UK. I don't really know what day it is. I don't know what time it is.
It's Sunday, because the Sundays are Dracula. So there you go. Everybody is something that you can know, at least when it's Sunday.
Yeah, but we're almost at the end of May, and I don't know where all of May has gone, and I don't really know what I've done. And I think a lot of people who have been observing this kind of quarantine, especially where your days are structured very similarly, you get up, you eat, you maybe go and work at the kitchen table, and then you go to bed again, and then rinse, repeat.
Yeah.
The days start to lose their kinds of the things that make them distinct. And this is this is an imposed kind of quarantine that Jonathan has. He can't leave the castle.
He is going through that.
As well.
And also, like what Lauren said earlier, that the kind of disruption of time too, that the fact that this whole narrative reflects that. I mean, because the story is not told in a chronological order. It is this is the time is out of joint, from Hamlet. And that kind of makes for, an uncertain nature of reality. There's a great Philip K. Dick novel called Time Out of Joint, and all of Philip K. Dick's novels are about that uncertain nature of reality, and that's the phrase that he uses to kind of describe this. People are not understanding their reality and what's going on, is that using that line from Hamlet, time is out of joint. So that's a little bit, Anastasia. I think we'll leave that there. But as anything we talk about here, I welcome everybody to continue the conversation on the Facebook page, and or write me an email, or write me a nasty email saying you are so full of it. That would be the greatest thing in the world. I'm a Philly guy, so and I get booed, I'm happy, and no one's booed me yet. Everyone's loved it. So that's the Rosenbach once. We want everyone to love this. I take that back. Don't boo me. I'll get fired. Great. Let's May 28th then. That's the next entry. And then we get
I do have to say, I've just realized I've highlighted a little bit, just going back to what you were saying about the Gothic heroine. When on 19th of May, when Jonathan writes, I would fain have rebelled, but felt that in the present state of things it would be madness to quarrel openly with the Count, whilst I am so absolutely in his power, and to refuse would be to excite his suspicion and to arouse his anger. That is such a Gothic heroine line.
And it's a powerful thing too. He's saying, I'm under your power, but I'm going to acknowledge that and utilize it for my own purposes.
Yeah. That could have been taken directly out of an Anne Radcliffe novel. That is such a kind of, I am so absolutely in his power. I think that I wouldn't necessarily feminize as Jonathan, but for any reader who had, been familiar at that point with the Gothic, I think you'd read that line and be like, oh, I know where this is going. Like, this is a Gothic narrative. Like,
yeah,
it's a really good example of a convention being recognizable, but used in that new and exciting way. And I feel like that bit there, it's kind of hinting like you've read this before, you know what this means, but it's not going to go where you think it's going to go. I think it's really clever to put that sort of 4 chapters in when you're holding a novel in your hands that you know is quite weighty. It's just such a good line as well.
Good. All righty. I want to, good. Well, then let's go on to May 28th then, because then this is when he sees the gypsies, the Zagani, the Romani people here who are helping Dracula. And then he's got this description of them too, that they're fearless, they're without religion, they attach themselves as a rule to some great noble or boyar and call themselves by his name. This is when I thought it would be a nice moment to share just a little bit of Stoker's notes, and that not all the notes that he wrote are, in his own almost impossible to read handwriting. Thank God, scholars like Elizabeth Miller and Robert A.T. Besang and have deciphered his handwriting for us. But a big chunk of the notes are actually typewritten. This is some of them now, and a lot of them, not all of them, but sometimes they are books that Stoker was reading, and this is one of those, and this is from a book called Roundabout the Carpathians, from the author Cross, that Stoker, and I'm going to share a few pages of this and just go through it kind of quickly. Just to give a kind of illustration of how Jonathan is using his research in order to create the world that his character has to go in, because Bram Stoker himself has never traveled to the Carpathians. And let's see, here's the first one, and let me make this a little larger. But this is the Roundabout the Carpathians. He had to write the in there, with a little caret, because he had missed it typing it, or had somebody type. I think maybe he's typing these. I'm not sure. They're poorly typed, and there's lots of corrections. We do know that when he had to have his manuscript typed up, he didn't do it himself. He hired someone to do it. But here you even get the plum brandy, the Slivovitz plum brandy right here. Whoops, let me spotlight here. Yeah, here's that is put, a bottle of this is put in the cart, or in Dracula's carriage. It's under the seat. Here we have the robber steak that he eats at one point, and the bits of beef bacon and onion strung on a stick. I mean, Stoker just takes this description and uses it in the novel, just changes it around a bit. But it is Stoker using his research to do this stuff. Anything else? Dogs in Hungary, dangerous. I love that little detail there, because they are in this. That is, these dogs are dangerous, that Jonathan will encounter. Let's move to the second page of this here. There's 3 pages from this Roundabout the Carpathians. And I think this is the second page. It is. And this is where we get the information about the Zagani people here. Make it larger. Here they are. And he has, first, there's the golden mediash is one of the wines. That makes it into the text as well. Lots of paprika stuff. I think on the other page there might have been another paprika Hendel mentioned, the chicken. But here's Zagani, gypsies, 150,000 in Hungary. I think he changes that to there are thousands of them living in at one point, is what he says. But here this gypsies hang on to Magyar castles and call themselves by name of the owner and professes faith, whatever it be. That's just that's just a note that he's just put directly into the text. Here's one that he didn't use that, boy, it would have been cool if he had, because this is the Raven King right here, Matthias Corvinus, the King of Hungary. Look him up sometime, and a fascinating figure, and built these giant libraries all about recovering knowledge and furthering knowledge, and his Corvinus is Raven last name here, and he's the Raven King, not from Jonathan Strange. That's a different Raven King. That's John Usclass in Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. But Stoker doesn't use Matthias Corvinus. But this last one here is really interesting too. This is the last page of this Roundabout the Carpathians, and horses to be disturbed at approach of Count Dracula and smell blood! Exclamation point. Like he thought, like, this is a really thing. And I think we get it. We get that on the carriage from the Borgo Pass, don't we? The carriage that takes Jonathan there. Maybe the horses act up. But he's, of course, in control of his horses because he's the carriage driver. So I guess you can't go too crazy with that detail. But it's an interesting point, I think, where he's taking notes and also a little memo to himself, you know, about this. That's just when he came up with it, is when he's doing these notes. And here's the Sieklers here, CKs, one of 4 Transylvanian races, and he uses some of these details as he's talking about it. But right here at the bottom, I love this. He says, page 223 in Roundabout the Carpathians, he just has a phrase, grim, phantom, haunted clouds. And it's written in his own, so he had come across it later, and then he wanted to add it to the notes. And then I thought, oh, did he use it? And I quickly looked at the text, and he never uses it in the text. But he does have one point in the text where he writes ghost-like clouds. I can't remember where that is exactly. You can look it up in a text. But he does use that briefly, ghost-like clouds, which he's clearly taken that phrase from Cross's Roundabout the Carpathians. This is on chapter 13. I love the titles. The title of the chapter is chapter 13, and then there's subject headings, and it is Hungarian hospitality, Wallach laziness, fishing, settled gypsies, anecdote, old regime, fire, old Roman bath, the avifauna of Transylvania, and fly fishing. So unfortunately, fly fishing never made it into Dracula, but this is, you can find Roundabout the Carpathians online. I think it's available at Project Gutenberg too. That's where I was grabbing it from. There's a curious paragraph. Did you guys have anything on that? Because there's another curious thing in that I wanted to point out.
Not necessarily. I always just think it's interesting to me that this bit is something that gets picked up so often in stuff like, so Dungeons and Dragons has Castle Ravenloft, one of its most famous modules, and the Vampire Strahd. It's kind of inspired by the Dracula story, and Barovia, which is the sort of fantasy Transylvania, has a sort of a version of its own Romany people. I wouldn't go so far as to necessarily, as much as I love D&D and what Wizards have done with it, I wouldn't go so far as to say it's a positive representation. And it's not my area of expertise, so I'd kind of hesitate to say anything on it, but I do think it's really interesting that this sort of, I guess it is xenophobia, that this is another element that gets picked up on. Like if we're talking about the otherness and the foreign other and the fear of the sort of racially ambiguous, that the fact that you have these gypsy people who Stoker has researched to make sure he gets it right to include it. I think that's a really interesting, I'm interested in the fact that he researches it and includes it in the first place, but also that people keep picking up on it again and again and again. That it seems to be something that we keep kind of coming back to. I guess like the high forehead and the aquiline nose, that it's something that kind of sticks out and maybe it's lost its context as we go. But I do find that interesting, particularly when we're talking about sort of you know, the anxieties about the foreign other, and about, you know, what is whiteness and where does it come from, and how do you know, you know, what bits of Europe are acceptable and what aren't.
And to
I think it's really interesting
to find a people who are always labeled as the other too, the Romani people too. So they lends themselves so well for a narrative like this, and horror narratives in general, because not only does Transylvania become a byword for where horror is set, but, you know, Romani people do as well, and they're constantly feed them, and it's the Wolfman, and these are the people, these other people, these outcasts who just travel around, who are often situated in those narratives. And Stoker's got a lot to do with it. You know, Dracula has a lot to do with it because it is so popular. Yeah. And Stoker thinks this is what these people are, because I read it in this book, and this book isn't obviously racist because it's all the people, and this is what they do. And and he uses those details for this. So
it's kind of like the Paradise Lost effect. It's that kind of, where did this idea come from? Because we keep seeing it pop up, and I am interested to kind of think that this seems to be written almost innocently, but to write about a whole people saying, yeah, they're fearless, they have no religion, they're beyond the law. That's just a fact. That's just a factual thing about this place that I have written in. And I guess it kind of goes back to what Mary was saying about anti-Semitism. It's kind of picking apart where it comes from in the first place. But I am just fascinated that is something that Stoker puts in and that people keep coming back to. Not always positively, but it's just a really fascinating element of it that I think.
And they would dedicate, and these people would dedicate themselves to whatever Boyar happens to be there, no matter even if he eats babies. So
yeah.
I do want to move on. I want to make sure we get all this. Mary, did you have anything to add to that, or should I keep rolling? Keep rolling. Good. And then we have Jonathan sees these workers, and he's going to try to get them to sneak his letters out. And it's the letter to Hawkins, and then he writes a shorthand letter to Mina. I have written the letters. Mina's is in shorthand, and he gives them the letters and asks them to mail them. Does he give them money too? I think, I can't remember, a gold piece. And maybe he stole it from the hoards that he's been finding in the castle. And then the Count, of course, because they are dedicated to their Boyar, and they give it to him, and the Count confronts him and is angry about the shorthand letter, is what he says. This is the Count playing the game, which I really do like. The Count's like, oh, they just happen to give me these letters, and and don't worry, I'll mail it for you, the Hawkins one. And then the other one, though, he's very angry that he can't read it because the Count has not learned the method of shorthand. What is it again that Josh told us was? I can't remember. The method of shorthand that is most likely the one that they're using. But I love that. That's an instance of, this is the first time Jonathan's gotten something over on him, right? And it's a case of this kind of modern system, or at least to Jonathan it seems very modern. I mean, shorthand systems go back a long time, but the particular one he's using is a 19th century based system, and this is the modern system coming to confound the Count.
Which is exactly the reason that Dracula has kept Jonathan alive so long. He didn't really need him to be alive all this time, but they've been having these nice chats about England and about English culture, and now I think he's realizing that, I guess I don't know everything. There's things that I haven't learned yet. But yeah, that's why was Jonathan not dead on arrival? It's because Dracula also needed something from him.
And he's kind of fascinated by what he needs from him, isn't he? He's fascinated by his modernity and his Englishness, as well as his usefulness.
Because that is most likely, several of the knights that we haven't had any word on is likely the Count pumping Jonathan for more and more information. But he didn't learn shorthand, and it doesn't matter because he got the letter anyway. So, so he locks him in his room, and Jonathan gets punished, and he gets locked in the room, and goes to bed. Slept without dreaming. Despair has its own calms. I like that. And then May 31. This morning, when I awoke, I thought I would provide myself with some papers and envelopes from my bag. He discovers that his paper is gone, his travel papers, and also his traveling clothes are gone. And we'll see those pop up and why Dracula has specifically stolen his clothes, not just to take away Jonathan's travel clothes. Although maybe Jonathan is so hung up on, his kind of British sensibilities that I can't travel, I don't have my traveling clothes. And then we jump ahead again, 17 June. We're getting towards the end of his experience there, but it's a bunch of pages. Better get through them. What does he say here? Oh, he's the carts. He describes the carts that the Zagani are bringing up, and again, these are like he's describing their clothes. This is all on the cart itself, the lighter wagon. I think that was right in the Carpathian notes too that he describes here, and these great square boxes, which I'll get to in a bit, because Jonathan has to sleep with them and sleep in, or the Count has to sleep in them, and so they need to be large and they're square, but they're not coffins as they're usually portrayed in most films. The Zagani laugh at Jonathan, and Jonathan is again reminded of his, not only is he powerless with the Count now, he's powerless with the hired help, with the guys who are just, bringing in the packing equipment, or have even power over Jonathan. Stop me if you want to add anything, but 24 June, before morning.
I love this bit. It's so, it reminds me of Catherine Morland in Northanger Abbey, sort of, getting overexcited and finding laundry lists, but
yeah,
it's this very sort of gleeful, like, terror experience.
And he's describing the night of the 23rd, and he sees the Count come out of his window again. But it was a new shock to me to find that he had on the suit of clothes which I had worn whilst traveling here, and slung over his shoulder the terrible bag which I had seen the women take away. There could be no doubt as to his quest, and in my garb too. This then is his new scheme of evil, that he will allow others to see me as they think, so that he may both leave evidence that I have been seen in the towns or villages posting my own letters, and that any wickedness which he may do shall be by the local people attributed to me. So he is disguising himself, and that's the illustration that we showed last week from the second, or from the very first paperback publication of this, with the Count traveling down the wall and in Jonathan's traveling clothes. And he's blaming Jonathan for his crimes, in a sense. And that ends with this kind of Jonathan, it makes me rage to think that this can go on, and whilst I am shut up here, a veritable prisoner, but without the protection of the law, which is even a criminal's right and consolation. I mean, Jonathan demanding his civil rights at this moment seems really, I think you have bigger problems, Jonathan, than worrying about your rights as a prisoner. Dracula, this is not by the code of the Geneva Convention, and which hadn't happened yet, but Jonathan.
It's kind of like Wicker Man. Jonathan is still adamant, and that's I love those types of narratives where someone is still depending on the legal and the rational, and you're like, no, you have to play by their rules. It's not gonna happen like that.
Law and order. Nope, baby in a bag.
Yeah, it's such a great tension builder, because Jonathan is so completely unprepared. You're like, how are you ever going to beat Dracula when you still think that you're going to be protected by the law?
All right.
I actually really like this next bit, because in terms of when he says, I began to notice that there were some quaint little specks floating in the rays of moonlight. They were like the tiniest grains of dust, and they whirled round and gathered in clusters in a nebulous sort of way. It's a really small, sublime moment.
Mm-hmm.
It's a really beautiful little addition. It doesn't need to be there, but just this moment where Jonathan is kind of caught looking at this really minor natural phenomenon, but notices the beauty of it. And then when he says, I watched them with a sense of soothing and a sort of calm stole over me, I really love that little addition, not only because it's a throwback to the sublime in the earlier Gothic, which is something that terrifies but also comforts the heroes and heroines of the 18th century Gothic. It's just such a nice little moment right before, and I think it's a really good tension builder. You have this moment where he's just looking at this really beautiful, natural little phenomenon, and he's like, it's so wonderful that he writes it in his diary. And then we go into this bit.
Yeah. And it's not natural. So read that next paragraph.
Yeah. Okay. Something made me start up, a low, piteous howling of dogs somewhere far below in the valley, which was hidden from my sight. Louder it seemed to ring in my ears, and the floating motes of dust take new shapes to the sound as they danced in the moonlight. I felt myself struggling to awake to the call of my instincts. Nay, my very soul was struggling, and my half-remembered sensibilities were striving to answer the call. It's such a good deception. It's just such a beautiful moment that you're like, oh yeah, I know this. This is the sublime. This is that beautiful moment. He's having this nice kind of, and then it's just completely pulled out from under you. I was becoming hypnotized, which again, huge obsession in the late 19th century, that idea of magnetism and hypnotism.
Mm-hmm. And also that continues in kind of, the vampire powers and a little later, the Count has this ability too.
I think Carmilla can do that. I think this is something, and it's kind of implied in Polidori as well, isn't it, Mary? That like magnetism, hypnotism type of thing.
Absolutely. So they materialize, and they're not just, little dust specks. It is, more and more they gathered till they seemed to take dim phantom shapes. And then I started broad awake, and they gradually materialized from the moonbeams, and this was the three ghostly women to whom I was doomed. So luckily, Jonathan does not just then panic freeze and wait for them. He fled. Right away.
Runs screaming from the place.
Yeah.
So that's another Gothic heroine thing, is sometimes actually fleeing and locking yourself in a room is actually the best thing to do. And
often often when you are confronted with extreme violence or death, you should probably get away, before you think to fight. Fight should be a last resort, obviously, but get away. That's smart. So Jonathan smartening up. And then
I think this is also why it's so effective on page. That whole scene of him looking and then being kind of tranced, and then him running, screaming, beautiful on page. In adaptation, slightly less effective.
It would look campy, It's hard to play him up like that, but it does work on the page. And then he hears. I love this because it's this kind of auditory experience. Then he hears the from his room. I heard something stirring in the Count's room, something like a sharp wail, quickly suppressed. And then there was silence, deep, awful silence, which chilled me. And then he notices the doors closed, and I sat down and simply cried. but it is another baby. Dracula has gone out in Jonathan's clothes and stolen a baby and given it to the vampire women, and then the woman shows up in the courtyard, the agonized cry of a woman, and he looks out and she throws herself. She sees him. When she saw my face at the window, she threw herself forward. Monster, give me my child. So Dracula has tricked whoever into thinking that, it's Jonathan that is the vampire, and has gone and stolen this baby. And she sees him at the window and thinks he has. And then the wolves show up, which is just, chilling, especially because Jonathan doesn't see what happens. The wolves show up. I heard the voice of the Count calling in his harsh, metallic whisper. The Count calls the wolves, and the pack of them poured in like a pent-up dam. There was no cry from the woman, and the howling of the wolves was but short. Before long, they streamed away singly, licking their lips. So, more good, exciting, gruesome stuff from the power of Dracula. Using now we've had these powers kind of lining up now. You can crawl on the wall. The vampire women can materialize and dematerialize out of some kind of dust mist. Dracula can control these wolves. He is strong, and Jonathan knows that by his grip when he first meets him, but also a little earlier that I think we didn't mention, when Jonathan tries to go back to the room that he saw the women, he finds that the Count the door is pushed shut so hard that it's a little broken and sealed just from the force of somebody pushing it, and it's obviously the Count has been angry and slammed the door. Somebody pointed that out to me. I can't remember who. One of our audience pointed out that it's a nice little moment of showing the Count's temper, that he was that the way he would maybe force the door is an example of him being really angry. And then we're getting to the very end of this chapter, right? We're at the 25 June morning. Actually, there'll be two entries. The first one, though, is, I love the way this begins, this kind of hope of dawn. 25 June morning. No man knows till he has suffered from the night how sweet and dear to his heart and eye the morning can be. That after everything that he's been through, it's the dawn that comes up on this day that finally inspires, Jonathan with a little hope, right? And this winds up being an idea that's, something again like the day and night. It's becomes all about vampire stories. The sun is the hopeful time, the dawn, because vampires can't stand the sun, and it's not true in Dracula. The Count
isn't that so fascinating though, that this does spawn that idea that the vampire cannot be seen in the day, and most adaptations and kind of reimaginings keep that idea, but multiple times we see Dracula in the light of day.
Jonathan says he's never seen
Jonathan
it, and he has.
Forgets it.
Yeah. So.
I think that's always, and I suppose it's because you have this, my fear fell from me as if it had been a vaporous garment. Like, that is a really powerful image. But I wonder if you're supposed to kind of have almost like if you're supposed to see that as a false sense of security, because maybe Jonathan's forgotten he's seen the Count in the day, but has the reader forgotten? Yeah. And that makes me really anxious as a reader, that Jonathan thinks he's safe in the day when I know that he's not. What do you think, Mary?
I think, yeah, definitely. It's lulling him into that kind of, I think I'm safe. But there's also all of those religious kind of things to it where, they call themselves a crew of light for a reason, and it's because Christianity, Jesus represents the light in this cosmic battle against darkness, and that's what Dracula represents. He's the night, he's the darkness, he's the evil, and he's also all of the kind of all the creatures that he turns into. They're often associated with the night, and you know, even the kind of mists, they're very much that kind of darkness and that obfuscation. Whereas with light, it breaks through that darkness, provides hope, but also that kind of I guess that kind of salvation, or that hope for salvation. So I think one of my notes that I have here is a little bit below. At the worst, it can only be death, and a man's death is not a calf's death, and the dreaded hereafter may still be open to me. And I think very much that image of light representing, you know, safety, but also I'm not damned yet. And I guess, yeah, that difference even now between him as a man in this castle, even though people think he's a vampire, he's not yet. He can still be saved, so he still has that hope.
That line as well, and a man's death is not a calf's death. Like, up until this point, Jonathan is infantilized and effeminized by not just Dracula, but by, you know, the vampire brides, by the castle, by the people, because he, you know, even though he's modern and he's civilized, he's educated, that doesn't really count for anything here. And that line to me kind of fits that dreadful reclamation of, well, at least if I'm gonna die, if this is the end, then at least in my death I can take back some of my power and some of my identity. I think that's really poignant as well. This sort of, I will risk it. I know that this is dangerous, but I've got, you know, the chances are desperate, but my need is more desperate still. It's kind of pushing back against that infantilization and that feminization, and kind of trying to claw back some of his own self, which, considering that this is the last that we have from Jonathan for a while, I think that's a really standout line.
He survives? No.
Oh, spoiler.
There's no way of keeping spoilers out of this. So I agree with all that, absolutely. So and he's inspired, and it's inspired, and then he does something that, you know, I think is often overlooked, that Jonathan scales down the wall of the castle to another window, and he just kind of, you know, brushes over it, and then he tries it and he scales down the wall, and that's a pretty extreme, you know, feat there for Jonathan to accomplish, and he does. Then he'll do it again later, so he does it twice, or 3 times. But he goes around, he searches in the castle, he finds that old gold in there in the one room that looks like it had been lying in the ground for centuries. This is perhaps the gold that Dracula was discovering in the Blue Fires. But he doesn't take it with him. So, you know, it's, I guess, left at the castle. Dracula figures he'll always have it there. And then he finds in this old chapel, this old, you know, unused chapel, he finds the 50 boxes of earth, and that the Zagati were filling, dug over, earth placed in great wooden boxes. And then he finds the count. There were 50 boxes in all. On a pile of newly dug earth lay the count. He was either dead or asleep. I could not say which, for the eyes were open and stony. So that's for Stoker. Vampires sleep with their eyes open. Without the glassiness of death, and the cheeks had the warmth of life. Through all their pallor, the lips were as red as ever. There was no sign of movement, no pulse, no breath, no beating of the heart. And Jonathan flees. He just, he looks for the keys first. That's right. He looks for the keys, and then he looks at the dead eyes, and such was the look of hate that I fled from the place. And Jonathan, and that the counts powers even asleep with his eyes open, which is creepy. Jonathan can't stand looking at him and flees. But before we get to that, Adam P. had written in about the logistics of the Count in a box, and they're talking about, like, if he can fit in there, these boxes have to be, and they're square, they have to be like 6 by 6, and that's never the way they're portrayed.
No.
Like, because they'd be massive boxes, and they wouldn't be able to put them all in whatever, a couple carts. But also Adam writes about, it would be like, he's thinking like each box will contain roughly 1,500 pounds of earth, 40 yards per cubic foot, times 36. Yeah, it would be too much. So we have to take that away. But he also asks about the coffin and the native earth part of the vampire legend, and wants to know, does Stoker elaborate on that? Where does it come from? Is it something from vampire folklore? And I would like to say right off the bat that I think it is. Adam writes, is it tied to the idea of the foreigner outwardly assimilating, but in reality maintaining his own culture and separateness? I like that idea, because I think it is this idea that Dracula needs to sleep on his own native soil is a reflection of how Dracula is tied to his native land. And when he talks about his native country earlier to Jonathan, this is the soil that has been fed with the blood of his people. Like he says, why there is hardly a foot of soil in all this region that has not been enriched by the blood of men, patriots, or invaders. That is an important thing to Dracula as a character, is his native soil. And Stoker, as far as I know, does invent this characteristic or limitation. I guess it's one of the vampire's limitations in this novel for the vampire. I've never found it in folklore, and so what I think it's another example of Stoker elaborating on an idea that the vampire in folklore returns to his own grave and sleeps there, which is the soil. I mean, the vampire sleeps in the soil where he or she was buried, and it's Stoker taking that idea and making, oh, that's a necessary part. Oh, it's a little bit about that too in Byron's Fragment, right? He has to be put in the vampire has to be put in a certain. It has to be laid in the moonlight, but he has to be taken to a certain place in the cemetery or tomb. I can't remember now. I'll have to look that up.
I mean, I think I know in Le Fanu, Carmilla has to go to her own tomb, which is how they find her. And in John Stagg's poem, The Vampire, which is one of the earliest British vampire narratives. Based
on that Stoker fragment, or that Byron fragment,
Yeah, that's I mean, in that, the vampire is very monstrous. It's more like a folklore vampire. But in Stagg's poem, the vampire comes from its own grave. But I mean, I have some stuff to say about nationalism and national identity. I know Mary knows a lot more than I do about vampire folklore, so you probably can say more on that than I can.
Mary?
I actually don't have anything to say about folklore, but I think it is interesting, not necessarily explicitly, but just implicitly, in terms of Stoker's own Irishness, being an Irishman living in London around a lot of Irish people who are similarly kind of away from home, and the focus that he puts in this novel on the gypsy communities that are a wandering community but also tied to land, but then also that kind of Jewish narrative, and the importance of the physical soil and the physical land and the physical homeland, and how important blood is to that kind of space. So I think not necessarily an explicit or necessarily a conscious thing that Stoker's doing, but a kind of implicit theme that is linking these kind of wandering communities that can't be home anywhere that's not tied to their home soil, in that way. So not folklore in that way, but
when Dracula invades too, when he brings it there, he's literally bringing Transylvania to England in his invasion, bringing the land itself.
So here you have a comment about the deathly, sickly odor of the kind of the soil, and when the kind of boxes are taken to England and they're being unpacked, I think one of the men says, "Oh, it smells like old Jerusalem," and again that kind of that odor, I think, is that kind of implicit Jewish foreignness that connects to another kind of old anti-Semitic trope that associates this kind of deathly, sickly smell, specific, distinct odor with that kind of anti-Semitic stereotype of the Jew. So I think, again, that's implicit here, tied to the soil and that kind of smell of death.
Yeah, like from a nationalism perspective, I mean, pretty much from after the 7 Years' War up until, you know, yesterday, the British Empire and what was the British Empire, what becomes the British Empire, is obsessed with the idea of British boundaries and British soil. And, you know, you have, I know we talked about this a little bit between ourselves, but Florence Marryat's Blood of the Vampire, which comes out at the same time, is more concerned with this in a way that you have this Creole vampire who is British, but is she? And, you know, and this is what you get in Carmilla. Laura is a British born, but is she actually? She's never seen England. She's never, you know, she's been educated by a French governess, and she, you know, does she have an accent? There's all of this anxiety about where the British Empire and where British borders finished and what British soil means. And especially the second half of this novel, it is very much a novel about invasion. And I think adding that layer of that the vampire takes its power and maintains its immortality by sleeping in its native soil, it empowers that idea. And when you read a lot of, so I have to read a lot of war propaganda, which isn't always the most entertaining. But one of the things that pops up from around about the French Revolution right through up into World War II is this idea of dying on foreign soil and being buried on foreign soil. And the last thing that you wanted was to be left on foreign soil. And often, you know, they would bring little bags of dirt over with them so you could chuck it into the grave, so there was at least something there to mark that grave. So there's this kind of, you know, if you think about the very biblical idea of like dust to dust and the idea of your body going into the ground, there's a lot of anxiety here about the location in which you are born and the location, you know, you don't get to just become of somewhere, you have to be of somewhere. And that's something that you have this huge anxiety about the more that Britain expands across the globe. And I think that's something that you're getting here, is that anxiety about what produces you. And if you have Britain suggesting that being born on British soil makes you somehow, you know, superior and chivalric, which obviously is a load of rubbish, but what does that mean for everywhere else in the world? And how do you know that, and how do you trace that? And I think that's what we're getting here, is that anxiety about what your native soil really says about you and how it empowers you. And yeah, just so much anxiety about invasion and otherness in this novel.
Well, Dracula's soil wasn't always anxiety-inducing. In the 1970s, I remember this as a kid, and I never bought it, and I'm always sorry. You could get genuine soil from Dracula's castle in this little coffin pendant. Oh my God, it kills me that I never ordered this. This is from the Warren Publishing Company. Jim Warren was the guy that published famous Monsters magazine and many other magazines. Several years ago, I found out that Jim Warren lived near me now, and he might still be there. I'm not so sure. And I met him at a talk that he gave around here at a local library. But You get a certificate of authenticity with this. This is actual Transylvanian soil from Vlad's castle in Transylvania. It probably wasn't. It was just probably dirt that, you know, somebody dug out of their backyard. But boy, I wish I had this. If anybody has this, yeah, I'd probably buy it. Like, I'd probably pay a good amount of money if I could get this authentic thing here. From
This is something we've lost from pop culture. We need to bring this back. I miss the weird stuff that you could mail order in the back of comic books.
What did it cost? I can't. I'm trying to see at the bottom here what it cost.
It was only $9.95.
Oh my God! I can't believe I'm $2 shipping in hand. I can't believe I didn't buy this as a child, but I certainly remember it being there. Wonderful. Well, we're kicking short on we're going to go a little long. We can go over 4 o'clock. That's fine, but I don't want to go too far over because we have to hit the end of this chapter. Obviously, the last day here, and what Jonathan encounters. It's the last day. He writes, on 29 June, today is the date of my last letter that he had provided for the Count. So he knows that this is, it. And I dared not wait to see him return, for I feared to see those weird sisters. I came back to the library and read there till I fell asleep. Well, weird sisters, I love that he's using that, thing that he gets from Macbeth. But also the idea that Jonathan's like, I went back to the library, I just picked up a book and read and took it. It seems so out of character for somebody who is about to die that here he would,
It's such a cling to English normality.
Yeah.
It's like we must have our tea and biscuits. Well, I'll just go to the library and read for a while.
So he does that, and then Dracula returns. He continues this ruse with Jonathan, like, oh yes, your baggage will be fine, and I'll be leaving, and then you'll be following me, and it's Dracula pretending still that everything is okay, but he says, I'd love, the Count stood up and said with a sweet courtesy, which made me rub my eyes, it seemed so real, that welcome the coming, speed the parting guest. So he's, and Jonathan's asking if he can, Jonathan calls him on it, right? Jonathan says, whoa, if I can leave, all right, I'll leave right now. And he takes him to the door and he has him open it, and the wolves show up. Jonathan realizes the door's unlocked, and then the wolves show up, and then, he has to tell him to shut the door. And then in silence, we returned to the library, and after a moment or two, I went to my own room. The last I saw of Count Dracula was his kissing his hand to me with a red light of triumph in his eyes and with a smile with that Judas in hell might be proud of. So that's a lovely moment of the Count reveling in, I've totally got you. There's no way you're escaping from me. And then Jonathan overhears again, we have this great auditory experience here that Jonathan's only hearing this, that he hears the weird sisters and the Count telling them, back to your own place. Your time is not yet come. Wait, have patience. Tomorrow night is yours. And then there was a low, sweet ripple of laughter. And in a rage, I threw open the door and saw without the 3 terrible women licking their lips. As I appeared, they all joined in a horrible laugh and ran away. Tomorrow, Lord, help me and those to whom I am dear. And then it's the next day that is the last journal entry. But now here's a textual thing that happens that you probably know. In the British edition of this novel, what Dracula says is, tomorrow night is yours. The American first edition of Dracula does not say that. The American edition says, he says to them, tonight is mine, tomorrow night is yours. And a lot of critics have talked about how it seems to be that there was an edit made for the British edition, that they took out the Tonight Is Mine, that they were trying to kind of tone down that homoerotic thing of Dracula saying "Tonight is mine" with Jonathan, and I've always read that, and I even talked a little bit about that last week with Josh. I actually don't know. I'm not certain that that's actually a censored edit in the British edition, because I'm wondering if it isn't just some kind of, mistake in a sense, because after the first scene, when Dracula tells the vampire women that this man belongs to me, it's already there, and that hasn't been censored out or edited out. So I don't think it matters so much if he said again, "Tonight is mine." And in the notes we have, "This man belongs to me," that Stoker puts that phrase 3 times in the notes. He's all about that. So that's there. And what's not in the text in the published book is "I want him," which he had put in his notes in one of the things. So I'm also thinking that "Tonight is mine" isn't even that. I mean, it's easily just tonight I'm going to feed on him. And then he never does too. But before I get there, he never even does, So for me, in a sense, it's almost like what he's saying is, tonight we're doing things my way. Tomorrow night you can do whatever you want to do. That it's not even about him feeding or anything.
But this edition that I have here is the Artworks edition, which is an annotated edition done by William Hughes, who is currently professor of Gothic at University of Macau, and wrote a biography of Stoker, has done lots of work, but also was the editor on Queering the Gothic.
Mm-hmm.
And I would have to ask him to be certain, but I feel like, so this edition was based on the first edition, but then also took into account reprints. And I feel like if Bill had felt that had been the case, he would have changed it, because the way that he taught this text to me was certainly through, let's look at this as a queer text.
Yeah.
So I kind of lean towards some kind of editorial mistake or some kind of, because I can't see that being a genuine censorship, especially considering some of the stuff that is published around the same time. But yeah, I would have to check with him, but this edition that I have was based on pulling together multiple editions to try and get the most authentic and the most informative for readers. So I don't know. I'm not sure if I
haven't checked. In the drafts of Dracula, they do have a section in the back that actually does comparisons with the typescript of the novel, which does exist, and changes from the typescript to the novel. And I haven't looked it up, but I wonder if there's a difference in there, then clearly maybe it is something that was changed. But I'll have to look at that after the show. So I tend to think that it's just "Tonight is mine" is I don't know, some mistake that got into it's weird. There's no I can't find out with a definitive explanation.
Yeah.
It is suspicious that it is another example of him claiming this male for himself.
Yeah.
That could have troubled people, but it's not there. So, and most editions of Dracula are actually taken from the British, so they only have tomorrow night is mine anyway. So, Mary, do you have anything to add to that?
I guess not really related to that bit, but I mean, it is interesting that it comes right after the Judas kiss moment, which obviously is a moment of betrayal, but it's also another kind of moment that can be read in a queer context. And there's a lot of work that's being done in biblical studies at the moment, looking at Judas and Jesus and their kind of homoerotic friendship and the way that that's portrayed in media. And I think, you have that intimate moment with Jonathan and the Count where there's so much that's not spoken. They both know what the other one is kind of doing. It's like, I know that you're keeping me here against my will, and
Mm-hmm.
you know that I know you know. And there's so much that's kind of connected in that. And then you just have this kind of, I'm going to bed, here's a kiss, and then yeah, you have the tomorrow night, or tonight's mine. It's just another moment of kind of intimacy and unspokenness. Yeah.
Let's get to the last day here. These may be the last words I ever write in this diary. And Jonathan goes to, wakes up. He discovers he's locked in his room this time, that he can't get out. Oh no, I'm sorry. He runs down to the hall and he tries the front door, and it's unlocked. I had seen the door escaped before me. I unlocked the chains, drew back the door won't move. It is bolted, so he can't get out. And then he figures I'll find the key, goes back to climbs down the wall again, which he does, and goes into the window and makes his way back to the crypt and finds the Count asleep. And this time the Count looks half renewed, as if his youth had been half renewed. The white hair and mustache were now dark iron gray. The cheeks were fuller. The mustache were, the cheeks were fuller. The white skin seemed ruby red underneath. The mouth was redder than ever, for on the lip were gouts of fresh blood. A little bit, he seemed bloated, as if the whole creature were simply gorged with blood. Dracula has obviously just fed on somebody, probably one of his Zagani, just like, come here, and fed on him. Mm-hmm. But it really, that whole picture of Dracula lying there asleep reminds me so much of the folkloric accounts of people digging up vampires, right? And they always describe how they're engorged with blood and the fresh blood on their lips. And something that, again, details that Stoker probably pulled out of his research, and to describe how, a vampire looks asleep. And then Jonathan has that moment where he realizes the danger that's going on here. That if the Count goes to England, mm-hmm. then where the teeming millions will satiate his lust for blood and create a new and ever widening circle of semi-demons to batten on the helpless. It's a great line.
Yeah.
But again, a giant jump in logic where the reader totally knows that's what's going on, or I think we do now, readers now do at least, but Jonathan doesn't know that's how vampires spread their contagion and they create more vampires. So that, I think, is clearly the moment.
It does kind of frame it in that xenophobia, because just before that he says, so the line about, the whole awful creature was simply gorged with blood. He lay like a filthy leech, exhausted with his repletion. So you're getting, again, that anxiety about an outsider feeding off of this kind of, feeding off of civilization, feeding off of something, that he's a filthy leech. I think that, it is a big jump for Jonathan to make, to suddenly be like, oh, this is definitely what he's going to do. But I guess it's kind of like, to me, it kind of contextualizes that, that kind of irrational outsider fear. You see this kind of during, the French Revolutionary Wars, that it goes from France is the arbiter of style, France is refined, France is civilized, to France is going to come here and they are going to corrupt us and they're going to bash our children's heads against the stone. And that kind of leap is ridiculous, but it's kind of contextualized in that seemingly very rational but irrational fear of a leech or an invader.
And the infection, the kind of contagion thing that's happened is, well, clearly we're going through that now as well. And somebody in the chat just said Corona vampire.
Corona vampire.
So, it is, thanks Benito. Benito said that. Thank you, Benito. That this is the fear, John, and that is something that will then, that's, most of the novel is, the rest of the novel is about this Dracula coming not only as a threat, but the specific threat is the kind of, the contagion, that he's infecting the people that he comes to. And you know, it's something that gets, you know, emphasized so much in, I mean, it comes from folklore and the original, you know, issue of people being afraid of vampires because people are getting sick in the village and they're dying, and it must be from this. This is the, you know, patient zero is this person who has become a vampire, and the panic that ensues, and then is picked up as a metaphor for vampires, and especially think the Nosferatu, the silent Nosferatu film with the rats leaving the ship, and then you know, everybody's carrying the coffins down the row, and this plague has hit this city, and the plague is Count Orlok. It is the vampire.
I mean, like you say, those kind of folkloric vampire accounts that they often come at times of plague and disease, and then also in the time that Stoker was writing this, you had all of this kind of this influx of immigration into London, into Britain, and especially in London, it was very much tied to that kind of Jewish other. And with those narratives, you have these narratives of plague and disease and the threat of invasion, and it's going to spread throughout the country, and you know, we have to save Britain. So it's very much tied up to the kind of plague threats.
We will get into all that soon, you know, but now Jonathan finally attacks the Count, right? Picks up the shovel. I'm gonna kill him, and just as the shovel's about to hit, he sees the basilisk gaze of Dracula turns towards him, and he falters, and he just gives him a gash in the head, and Jonathan flees in terror.
It's another really interesting moment, I think, because the basilisk is also something that's associated with these kinds of anti-Semitic stereotypes.
Oh, is it? I didn't know that.
Yeah. So Martin Luther writes in On the Jews and Their Lies, talks about the kind of poisonous basilisks in relation to it's this diatribe against Jewish people. But one of the things that in myth that could kill a basilisk is a cockcrow. You know, the cock crowing, and you have that a few pages before.
Yeah.
Jonathan wakes up, and it's the morning of
by the sound. Yeah.
The cockcrow, and then here you have that image of the basilisk and Dracula, and he doesn't quite kill him here, but it kind of lays the groundwork, I think, for, you know, the moments of Dracula, you know, what happens later in the book.
Yeah. Well, he flees, and then he's, you know, locked in. He can't get out. I ran the
net of doom.
Yeah, I was again a prisoner, and the net of doom was closing round me more closely. And then he has this great, he's hearing everything, right? The sound of many tramping feet, crash of weights being set down, sound of hammering, tramping again in the hall. The door is shut and the chains rattle. There's a grinding of the key in the lock. I can hear the key withdraw, and then another door opens and shuts. I hear the creaking of lock and bolt. He hears them in the courtyard, the crack of whips. I am alone in the castle with those awful women. Foe. That's spelling out, the writing down and interjection.
Your own diary.
He is repulsed by, I'm so repulsed, I'm writing it down. It's like in Monty Python and the Holy Grail when the monk dies and he writes, down the page. But he's alone in the castle, and he's promises that I'm going to try to scale the wall and escape, but if not, you know, goodbye all, Mina. So he is resigning himself to the fate that he won't be able to make this escape. So sorry for the people who have only reading it for the first time that we've hinted that he does. No, he doesn't. He dies. He actually dies. Now this is the last we will see of Jonathan. And that will be.
I do love how effective that is, because you're pretty sure you're going to see Jonathan again, but because you only hear it and don't see anything, or that auditory horror is such a good way of kind of building that terror. because you know something is happening, you know something's going on, but you can't see it. And because you can't see it, there's all that ambiguity of what's happening. It's such a good device that I feel like Stoker hits on at multiple points in this novel. You can, you know, Jonathan throughout the castle can hear and not see, or see and not hear. And that kind of like sensory deprivation is so effective that when you do then switch to Mina, you are kind of like, oh no, what happened? Like, genuinely what happens is such a good cliffhanger, because you are denied that usual reader superiority.
Yeah.
Jonathan doesn't know, so you don't know either. Like, you can't read between the lines because he's not seeing anything, he's only hearing it. I think that's a really effective Gothic convention. I really love the way that bit's kind of structured.
Lauren, somebody asked in the questions here if you could state the name of the version you're reading again.
Oh, so this is the artworks. I don't know if you can still get it.
Yeah, is it even available? Well, who's the editor on it? Or?
I suspect that there are some former Bath-Spa University undergraduates who might be selling copies. So if you look up on Abe Books, this is from 2007. It was actually a project done by Bath-Spa University. So I think it was some undergraduate students worked on editing it with the academics as part of their final year project. And it's a really wonderful edition. But I'm happy to post, I can give you the ISBN, but the editor is William Hughes.
Okay. And you can send that info to me. I can post it on the Facebook group too.
And if his biography of Stoker is really fantastic, so I recommend that too.
Well, I have cut out literally almost like a quarter of my notes to talk today, and I thought last week was going to be tough, and it wasn't in the end. This week, there's so much more that I really wanted to hit on this. I wanted to share some more notes. I wanted to talk about Sortes Virgilianes, which I touched on last week, but I had more to add. There's so much in this book. Mary, did you have anything further to add before we cut out? Do you have a note that like, oh my God, you didn't talk about this, and I need to say this?
No, but just I agree with Lauren. I think the use of present tense in that last
bit, yeah.
Now I hear it, you know, you can hear it. You can imagine yourself in Jonathan's shoes, and then like Lauren said, it then switches to Mina, and you're like, oh wait, what?
Yeah.
Where am I?
Such a good dramatic technique, going from this moment in the castle to Lucy and Mina writing to each other. I think the first time I read it, I was like, wait, what's happening? Like, what's happening now? It's such a wonderful dramatic technique.
All righty. Let us close up today then. We'll close the door. Thank you for everyone. Thank you all for tuning in today, or if you're watching this program on replay. We will post this recording on our website. That's how you found it. It'll also it's also on Facebook now, where we're streaming live. And join our Facebook group if you can, where we continue the conversation. It's been a lot of great talk in there. I've learned a lot of things from there. Dacre Stoker's been contributing all sorts of wonderful stuff on there. And I'm always available to answer your questions if you want to send them to email, and by email I can forward them to other co-hosts as well. Next week we will have the return of Josh O'Neill, who did the first chapter with me. Josh, who's doing the Dracula the Evidence Project for Beehive Books, has been deeply immersed in Dracula for some time now, putting that together. I very much look forward to that. Don't forget, we'll have special guests in June. Dacre Stoker, Grady Hendrix, Leslie Klinger will all be here. If you're looking for more virtual engagement in our quarantine world, head over to the Rosenbach website that I showed you earlier, rosenbach.org. You can find out all kinds of virtual things that we're doing. If you'd like to make a donation to the Rosenbach so we can continue to bring more shows like this, create even more programs and courses inspired by our magnificent collections, go to our website, click on that support tab. I would be more grateful than a trio of vampires receiving an entire bag of babies. So, Mary and Lauren, thank you so much for talking with me this week. I hope you enjoyed the experience. I hope we'll see you again.
Thank you for having us. It's been really wonderful. And
Good.
if you have any more questions for Mary and I, or you would like to find out about any of the Gothic stuff we're doing, we're very active on Twitter, so you can find it at Sheffield Gothic or at the Reimagining. And if you want to ask about anything we've mentioned or talk to us more, please just spam us on Twitter. We love talking about the Gothic.
Yes,
so
you're easy to find on Twitter. If you look up your names, you can find you.
Yes,
and also your how often are you doing your YouTube video cast?
We're hoping to start doing it once a week. We're in the process of starting content. So we will be doing conversation videos, which is Mary and I discussing all things Gothic. And we have something fun planned as a sort of a fun guide to all things Gothic. So I won't give too much about that, but we're currently scripting that, and hopefully in the future we'll be able to start expanding. We're hoping to bring our reading group to YouTube. So watch this space, and if you have any ideas or any thoughts, then please let us know.
I will happily join a reading group and reading the kind of works that you're reading.
We have some videos coming out hopefully this week if I can finish editing them, and then hopefully, like Lauren says, hopefully we can do this on a more weekly, regular basis. So yeah, just I guess watch this space.
Excellent. Good. Yeah, and send me whatever, and or Lauren, I know you're on Facebook. Post that you can post on Sundays with Dracula. Feel free to do that. Join us. So thank you both, Mary and Lauren. Join us next week on Sundays with Dracula for Chapter 5, when we move from Transylvania. We meet Mina and Lucy and the boys, Jack and Arthur and Quincy, and we'll get a bit about a curious patient of Dr. Seward named Renfield. So once again, I'm going to play us out with Tucker Christine's Pleated Gazelle song, Storm at Whitby. Farewell, everyone. And in the words of our friend Dracula, go safely and leave something of the happiness you bring. Bye-bye.
Bye.